Now I would like to give the floor to Tim. We are very happy to have you, Tim, as well at the seminar, and thank you for accepting our invitation also to share your insights on the topic of the functional areas from both an academic and a practical perspective. Let me introduce to you Tim. He's the Managing Director at the Business of Cities, an urban advisory and policy unit based within University College of London. For the past 10 years, he has worked with organizations such as Brookings Institution, OECD, and the World Bank, and on questions of metropolitan and functional governance and economic development. And he has also participated in advisory boards informing the strategic planning of metropolitan areas and city regions such as New York, Oslo, and Brisbane. And he's also an honorary lecturer at University College London and the co-author of the book World Cities and Nation States. So thank you, Tim, for being with us today, and we're looking forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you. Thank you, Ilona, and thank you, Simin, for covering so much fantastic ground in those opening introductions. Really appreciate it, and I think a lot of what I'll talk about will be complementary to that, but coming perhaps from a slightly different perspective. What I hope to do is to think about the problematic of functional areas from the perspective of cities. A lot of the work that we do in our work and our team at the Business of Cities in London, working with the City Leadership Lab at UCL, thinking about in what kind of challenges leaders, policymakers at cities, metropolitan, regional levels are faced with, and in what ways they are innovating in the way that they address these kind of issues. And I hope really to present a kind of scan, a global scan of what these leaders are facing, what their impressions are, and what kind of shared lessons might be observable that might apply both in Romania, across the EU, and beyond. And so what I would like to start by doing is really talking about the kind of the macro picture of what we really mean by functional areas, in what ways that might be changing, in what ways do we need to really flesh out our thinking, and why these 2 days are in fact very important to that agenda. I think firstly it's important to say that I'm guessing almost everyone in the room lives and works in a country that is experiencing some version of the phenomenon of suburbanization of population, metropolitanization of the economy, regionalization in some form or other of functions, shared services, shared assets, shared identity, shared infrastructures. We know, of course, this is also a phenomenon very obviously. Do you want me to speak a bit closer? Yeah, okay, sorry. This is a phenomenon very obviously visible in Romania as well. The latest evidence suggests that about 10 of the 15 fastest growing cities within Romania are within functional agglomerations, and equally the rate of the built urban footprint growth in Romania over the last 30 years is around 40% faster, 40% more expanded than across the EU on average. So interesting questions there about what that poses for functional cooperation in this country. And I think it means that as around the world, therefore, there's a recognition that because of these processes, firstly, that the political geography no longer, if you like, well maps, apart from in places that accidentally inherited a functional kind of scale in its governance structure from a long time ago. Rarely, otherwise, does the political geography match the economic geography. Secondly, as we've heard from Ilona and Simin, territories also inherit a wide variety of shared inheritance and shared assets, shared identities, shared needs. Industries are also finding that the need in certain cases to cluster has become more paramount, and the need for that to be shaped actively needs to be more closely observed. And then finally, of course, we observe that there are many challenges around the way that the political response to this metropolitanization and functionalization process has been too slow. to catch up, if you like. And so this is a shared agenda almost everywhere around the world, and what I'll do in a few minutes is pick out a few examples of how different countries, different parts of the world are responding in different ways for different reasons. And really, I think, as Simin mentioned, the functional areas conversation has been going for at least half a century, and the policy reality and the policy response has been something we can observe for decades around the world. But I do think there are quite a number of unanswered and unresolved questions that we have to debate over these 2 days, but also we must develop a stronger research response and a stronger policy response to. Firstly, for example, to what extent, as Simin alluded to, where do functional areas start, where do they finish? To what extent are functional areas being refigured by transport, by changing technologies, by changing patterns of self-employment, by changing cultural forms of consumption, etc., etc. Secondly, how strong really are agglomeration effects everywhere? To what extent are functional relationships and the building of functional integration, to what extent are they twinned with outcomes relating to productivity, but also a variety of other social outcomes? We can see a lot of contested evidence, a lot of evidence that is varied in different contexts, in different nations, and we need to be clearer, I think, about exactly what the contributions are and what kind of policy responses are needed in different cases. We need a clearer account, I think, of whether agglomeration and functional development, whether these the disparities that emerge are, as Simin explained, it often presented, the natural outcome of economic processes, or to what extent they are self-fulfilling prophecies of all kinds of political decision-making, of the criteria of public investment, and so on, that you're very familiar with. I think all of these things need to be understood more clearly, and in what ways can declining areas within functional areas, but also on the fringes and the gaps between functional areas within nations and across nations, what kind of policies can really be developed to support these things? Now, I think it's fair to say that, as Simin very powerfully explained, most governments around the world, particularly at national level, have tended to become more focused on the possibilities and potential of functional areas, precisely because they've observed or they perceive a certain dividend or benefit to, economically speaking, the greater the level of connectivity and efficiency that is observed within functional areas. And the variety of responses have arisen precisely in recognition of this agglomeration consensus, if you like. And in general, and particularly in Europe, in a context where, globally speaking, European functional areas are relatively smaller compared to those that are emerging around the world, and many are also growing at a slower rate than others around the world. There's become more pressure at the policy level to think about in what ways functional areas can provide greater combined scale, in what ways they can provide increased visibility in certain markets, or perhaps even with one's national government, to what extent they can provide a certain degree of diversity, particularly economically, in terms of becoming more resilient to economic shocks or other kind of unanticipated changes, in what ways they can provide more coherence, both mentally and physically, and in what ways, if you like, there's an opportunity to create more cohesion, despite the fact that we've observed so many tendencies towards the other direction. So these are the reasons, if you like, that many governments, national, regional, and supranational, are in favor of more support for functional areas, but it only works if they are well organized, if they're well organized in terms of the policies and well aligned in terms of the policies and the infrastructure, but also, as Simin alluded to, the institutional development at that level and the investment that is supported to coincide and support that scale. Otherwise, the risks tend to be, and most regions around the world can observe this, there's whether you're in a fast-growing region or you're in a shrinking functional area, the risks are of increased political and economic fragmentation. The risks are that you do not create critical mass in the places that you need to with the projects that you bring forward. Public investment is perceived to become too diluted, to have real catalytic impact. There's a concern about a low coordination and limited capacity if there is too much duplication and competition between different authorities within a functional area. And in general, there's a concern that a functional area is not able to either speak to itself or speak to others as one place, and they're not able to communicate its needs, communicate its advantages in the way that it needs to. And it's fair to say, I think, that when we look at places all around the world, most attempts to organize around functional areas so far have been quite limited or sporadic or non-existent. And the reasons are ones that are familiar to all of you, I think, whether that's to do with local government politics, whether it's to do with national policies that are unintentionally subsidizing the very processes that they wish not to bring about, or whether it's to do with very high levels of silo between national spatial policies, which are increasingly functional in their orientation, but other departments of national government that do not have a spatial or place-based approach. Whether it's fiscal incentives that encourage or militate against the kind of cooperation that's needed at functional level, whether it's regulation barriers that prevent cross-border working, whether it's a particular decision about a big transport investment that doesn't fit with the emerging functional or the existing functional linkages, whether it's various land use deals or the role of real estate or capital investment who have their own preferences and ambitions that do not fit with that functional ambition. So you can imagine that all of these processes in almost every country, in every functional area, are to a certain extent visible. The question is, in what ways can we try and move beyond them? The second observation I would make is that functional integration and functional patterns are kind of cohere across a whole range of factors and a whole range of scales geographically, as we all well know in this room, I think. And firstly, of course, that's to do with its functional integration is something to do with the role of companies, whether it's in terms of their own networks, their clusters, their supply chains. It's to do with the spatial pattern of population, the travel to work zones that are changing all of the time. It's to do with changing patterns of lifestyle. And also it's something to do with the shared nature of equipment and services and functions that we've already discussed, and the need to therefore support shared connectivity as well. We're also seeing that functional various kind of policies are coming forward at various degrees of maturity and intensity to support functionality right across the scale. So whether it's in terms of the very large global mega regions around the world that are observing that, yes, they may not have daily commuter flows between or across the whole of these regions, but there are important needs to coordinate growth, agree on large-scale infrastructure, recognize there are business-to-business interactions and logistical and supply chain linkages that need certain degrees of intentionality around them. This is happening particularly in East Asia, probably most obviously in the Greater Bay Area of Hong Kong, but also elsewhere, and increasingly now in California. We can see them at this mega-region scale being very important. Secondly, cities that are fairly proximal, fairly close to each other, increasingly observing that there may be a particular prerogative to cooperating around a particular agenda. Maybe it's a particular piece of infrastructure. Maybe it's about visibility to certain international audiences and customers. Whether it's in terms of also complementarity, making sure that cities are specializing in complementary activities, not competing ones. And then, of course, as everyone in the room knows, many kinds of attempt to build integration at the metropolitan scale, often incentivized or if you like, catalyzed, shall we say, by relocation of functions or major events or major investments that have been brought forward, or whether it's in terms of new patterns of economic and spatial development due to a kind of certain threshold of growth that's been observed. So these are three of the scales, and of course there's the big question of in what ways are functional linkages between secondary cities, between corridors and rural areas are emerging, often accelerated by, firstly, digital connectivity that allows people to perhaps extend their their stays or their activities across, for example, a weekend because an increased work-life balance that's being pursued in many parts of the world, or whether it's to do with the increased recognition that functional areas share environmental goods and share services and amenities, as well as immediate economic specialization. So this is an observation to say there are many models emerging around the world. There's no one model or one approach. Increasingly, there's recognition that these do not only adhere to core periphery style ways of thinking about functional areas, but also there are more distributed models that are emerging, and ways in which to foster and support those are coming to the fore. But I guess for all of us working in the research and analytics dimension of functional areas, big challenges also are very visible in terms of what kind of data gaps there are to really measure in a live sense the commuter flows and other patterns of movement within these areas, whether there are embedded or inherited biases or assumptions that help limit the effectiveness of certain kinds of approaches to measuring functional interaction, to what extent very rapidly scaling technologies are changing the functional equation, and in what extent all of the time other kinds of cultural and social relationships, affiliation and interdependencies need to be borne in mind. This is I think it's very clear that there's a risk of approaches becoming outdated relative to the changes that are often observed on the ground. And equally, this can often result, for example, in very different definitions of what are functional area. These are just 4 definitions of Jakarta's functional agglomeration, and therefore what kind of scale of active organization need to actually come together around that. Or all kinds of confusion, as Simin alluded to actually, around what kind of degrees of territorial inequality are really visible in different nations, depending upon what kind of functional definitions you're using. Big debates in the UK earlier this year around to what extent the imbalances are visible relative to other European and global countries, all dependent on how you define these things, and therefore we need to be very careful in how we think about these questions. And then finally, before I get into some examples, increasing recognition, just to reiterate, that all kinds of disruptions, firstly in relation to the sector mix that industries, that cities and functional areas are hosting, industry preferences, whether to cluster, whether to disaggregate their functions or consolidate functions, are increasingly being observed around the world. The role, for example, that better transport or improved technology is having in terms of encouraging long-distance commuting, more self-employment, more kinds of part-time membership or of a functional area, if you like. And then finally, different sorts of ways in which information is being gathered, both by companies and policy, that are changing the equation as far as what kind of decisions are made about where to locate functions, what kind of supply chains do you need to organize around, what kind of knowledge partnerships, how do teams assemble and disassemble. All of these, I think, practices are being addressed very importantly by a lot of ESPON research, and I think this is a very important dimension of what we mean to understand the future of functional areas. Now, I just want to highlight fairly briefly a few examples from some of this from our work, some of this from work of colleagues around the world, just thinking about how different nations are responding, and might be different players that are, if you like, taking the lead in this respect. I think it's first to say that there are many successes and weaknesses of all of these approaches. There's no one right answer or one success story that I'm going to point to, but there are different processes at play. So we might say, for example, Japan's a good example outside of Europe of a country with a large number of shrinking functional areas. And there's been, firstly, recognition in Japan of 2 things. One is that the attempts to kind of organize cap population or distribute or create very strict population targets around where population or activity should go have not worked particularly well so far, and that equally there hasn't been sufficient institutional development at the metropolitan or functional level to really support particularly shrinking or stagnating functional areas to grow. But where they have experienced success is around the model of actual development that has occurred. A lot of high degree of compact and connective development. It often means that there's less abandonment of aging populations in the areas where that has been brought forward. Active renewal of new towns is now really being developed to encourage younger people to stay in the vicinity of other generations and provide a lot of the services and economic support, and in a certain sense attempts to optimize new development around new connectivity or existing rail stations and things like that. The overall model of development is helping to militate against the overall economic decline of some of these regions, even though the institutional and the policy approach has been increasingly recognized to have been limited so far. If we look at an example like Australia, here's an example of a country, highly fragmented functional areas across the board. Federal government over the last 5 or 10 years, increasingly proactive, thinking about in what ways can they support these functional areas to grow. As Samin alluded to, different approaches in different places depending on what kind of inherited political capacity, but also inherited economic geographies of those places. So, for example, in Sydney, there's been more of an attempt to, where there's a high degree of fragmentation, to build a metropolitan and functional layer of governance and increasingly add competencies to it. Whereas, for example, in southeast Queensland, the Brisbane region, if you like, there's been an attempt to, because local governments are larger and more powerful, to increase the level of coordination among them rather than create an additional layer of government and then create different agendas and different supports. The key role that has been pursued in Australia is one of city deals in the last couple of years, in big investment packages, often designed to encourage cooperation at that functional scale, but also ensure that the 3 levels of government in Australia are working much more tightly than they used to. Ways of working are more aligned, and actual day-to-day levels of alignment are improved. And that there are all kinds of approach now to develop, as part of this, economic strategies for the first time at that scale, and increasingly recognise the need to shift from a commodities-dependent economy to an innovation and knowledge-oriented one. So, interesting journey that those regions are on, and if you like, the importance of customization and coordination being very important. In China, of course, the experience of China, of course, in terms of the demographic scale and the actual physical scale, of course, very different to what we have in Europe as a whole. But the interesting phenomenon of organizing around clusters of cities is relatively mature now, entering its second phase, if you like. There are now 19 of these around China. And often there's been a focus of engaging the larger corporate and state-owned enterprises, as well as local governments, around building the soft networks economically to collectively conduct research, to pool capital, to share risks, and focus on how to become more specialized as a whole. And now recognizing that there have been certain limitations to forcing that functionalism, and also recognizing that the incentives of local governments to build and generate their own land revenues through unproductive development, there's more of a shift towards in what ways to counter those incentives and to shift towards a shared culture and identity. Notwithstanding all the political limitations of this, I think there's some interesting ways of approaching and different focuses around how do the softer infrastructural and the softer networking effects of cross-functional regions, how can they cohere over time. In the USA, there's been, as you well know, a relative absence of federal leadership on the functional area scale of urban development. There are probably 2 processes to kind of tease out or observe that are emerging over the last 5 years or so. Firstly, the metropolitan leaders, or the metropolitan level, I think the 50 or so leading metropolitan areas in the US account for about 95% of population growth. In the US, and there's a big recognition that leaders, both at the public and private sector, need to start organizing at the metropolitan scale around functional trade and exports, building exports and trade plans for the first time, getting some more support from export service providers, improving the freight networks, becoming more internationally engaged in effect, and then increasingly developing a shared identity, and economic identity in particular, particularly in the medium-sized metropolitan regions. So I guess the economic strategy and international focus of these regions is growing. And then equally for the shrinking regions, functional areas, often in the Midwest of the US, there's a recognition emerging, if not fully developed, that actually the approach is to be more about improving digital skills through better IT training, improved regulation and incentives for SMEs to set up, for broadband investment to be brought forward, and for the fundamentals around municipal finance, public service delivery, reforming dysfunctional institutions, particularly the kind of system providers, utilities providers and things like that, focusing efforts initially in the medium-sized shrinking areas that are, where there's more critical infrastructure to work with. That's an emerging agenda in the US, with more to come, I suspect. And then, of course, many of you know numerous examples in Europe, and I'm just going to pick out one, not because it's been remarkably successful, but more because it reflects an emerging realization in many parts of Europe and elsewhere that actually the way to start building cooperation among functional areas begins slowly. It begins by creating soft rather than hard boundaries for who should be part of the agreement and who should not. A flexibility for different levels of enthusiasm and intensity over time, agreeing around what you can agreeing core principles for the future, and finding what kind of demonstration projects or catalytic projects can build trust and confidence. And I'm sure we'll hear many more examples over the next couple of days. In general, the literature and the practice around the world for shrinking regions, such as the Leipzig-Halle region I mentioned, but also those all around the world, is sort of observing there are two kinds of sets of approach to kind of build up from the ground up, if you like, certain levels of trust, as Samin mentioned, between local government, simply by setting up partnership meetings and MOUs, simply by sharing planned and sharing tactical ways of working, identifying who your shared clusters are, working more effectively with your business and civic leaders, creating more economic development partnerships and agencies and capacity that sits at the interface between public and private sector. That's on the governance side. And then increasingly recognizing there's a need to share assets, share infrastructure, co-locate functions. These are some of the ways that functional areas are building up when often they're faced with limited catalytic levels of investment or infrastructure at the national or higher levels of government. Now, I will touch on the comment that Samin made as I approach conclusion, which is to say that almost all of those countries and regions around the world are also confronting, just while they're also adopting these new approaches, these kind of questions that Samin mentioned around the rigidities in the way that the economic and physical development of functional areas have been developed, the risk, very real, of social and spatial and physical segregation, of bifurcation of the job market within functional areas, let alone what's going on between so-called winner-takes-all functional areas and even the cities at the center of them and others, and the role that they have different sucking in effects, but also in what ways they are pushing out or creating spillovers, and what exactly it is, therefore, that is needed to create more of a spillover effect. In what ways does one need to focus on diversification of the economy, complementarity of specialization, skills development, shared business climates, etc., etc. In what ways do these things militate against some of the patterns that Samin outlined so powerfully? And it's fair to say, as a summary observation, that you see, therefore, around the world, because of the different roles of national government, because of the different local political capacities, because of the different crises cities and regions and nations confront, and also the catalytic opportunities often that they might observe, they pursue very different ways of making functional areas become a little bit more integrated on that journey. Some will be focusing very much on managing growth more effectively, the hard infrastructure, the transport, the land management, the housing systems. Others are more about the institutional development and the investment to support that. Others have much more of an asset focus, relocation and consolidation of assets. Economic strategy is the preferred approach of other places that think that it's about a shared economic future that really drives functional cooperation and the incentives around that. The shift towards entrepreneurship and an innovation economy is also something we observe to be a driver of functional cooperation. And then finally, of course, the sustainability and resilience and the imperative more and more functional areas are now recognizing to work much more cohesively around that.
Now, we all know that in almost many cases, well, almost all cases, but there's a high degree of failure and a high degree of trial and error. And I think there's something to learn around, as we heard earlier on, the role of leadership or the lack of leadership in actually driving a functional agenda, particularly across political or economic cycles. The need to communicate this functional approach more effectively, communicate the dividend or the reason for doing it. An assessment is often lacking in terms of what it really is, if you like, the demand side opportunity. What is the reason from the future perspective of population, the economy, and other trends to actually work more effectively together? And also increasingly to address problems as they arise. Maybe it works initially, but then how is the institutional or cooperative relationship sufficiently flexible as new challenges appear? So given all of that, I think that we can safely say that there is a shared consensus around the world that even though places are doing it in different ways with different tools, that there is an imperative to move increasingly from functional areas that are entirely dysfunctional and disorganized towards ones that do have a high level of coordination, improved integration between different sectoral policies, a recognition that the level of fragmentation socially and spatially is intolerable and must be improved, and that there are important roles for both fiscal and land management tools in order to kind of support and improve that. And we might say that there are different ways in which places are doing this, and that a lot of them involve firstly thinking about what are the kind of initial fundamentals or the initial ingredients that really allow a process of functional coherence to begin. Then what are kind of tools or what kind of initiatives or mechanisms might enable that to kind of keep going and to have liftoff? And then finally, how do you achieve momentum beyond a 5 or 10 year initial progress cycle of progress? And we might say that a lot of it, as we've heard already, is something to do with building trust and that basic level of coordination. There's something around what is the role of strategic planning that considers multiple sectors and engages those beyond government in that process. Where and how can national leadership really be leveraged, as it were? And what is the research base and the evidence base and the advocacy base, if you like, to really push that approach? And then there's something around what are the projects that make this real? What are the ways in which consolidation needs to happen in different parts of the functional area? And how do you increasingly adjust and improve the institutional toolkit all of the time? Not just make one initial grand reform, but continually customize, as we've heard, and continually adapt over time. So this is the journey, I think, that we all have to confront in the functional areas we work in and are responsible for and are analysing. And how we do it, I think, is the big question and the exciting one. And I'm looking forward to a great couple of days of insights from everyone else in the room. So thank you very much.